What's up everyone, it's ENDYMION, and the Warhammer 40K saga keeps trucking away ever so, with things moving incredibly fast. From a fan website calling other fans bigots for not accepting the female custodian retcon to claiming the Emperor of Mankind is gender fluid, things are moving fast here. And beyond the Warhammer news, I want to also delve into that Kotaku article about Hades 2, which shows how hypocritical they are when it comes to sexy female characters in video games. But first, let's start with a fan website called Bell of Lost Souls. Also, don't harass anyone here, but let's simply dissect what they say and stay calm about it. Remember, we can't stoop down to these people's levels, we have to rise above it. Anyway, that article is titled, Warhammer 40K Only Bigots Hate Female Adeptus Custodians. This article was recently written by Abe Apfel, who claims that anyone who stands against these changes is nothing short of a bigot and should not be associating themselves with the Warhammer community at all. Most of what they say in the article is a giant word salad, but there are some parts where the writer claims that many concepts within 40K wouldn't exist without the help of women such as the Space Marines. And while he may be right that female scientists and characters like Erda or Selenar were important to not only things like Space Marines but Primarchs, this doesn't support the concept that because female characters were involved with something, they should now be included as units within the said faction. We already know that Games Workshop has tried in the past to implement female variants to factions when it came to commercial products, but it largely never worked out. Another article, this time from PC Gamer, attempts to dunk on the existing player base already, which is titled, Warhammer 40K has slightly more women in it now and the neckbeards aren't happy. This article, like the Bell of Lost Souls one, also attempts to paint the paying customer and fans of 40K as bigots who are not willing to accept things or change with the times. But at least in the PC Gamer article, they kind of prove the point of the fan base as well. There's one part where they cite the former head of IP at Games Workshop, which was spearheaded by a man named Alan Moret. He's since left the company in the following years, but he was asked via Facebook a while back why there aren't any female Space Marines. And his response to why female Space Marines don't exist really is the exact same reason as to why Games Workshop for decades hasn't really entertained the idea of female custodians. But anyway, here's what he said, and I quote, "The reason there aren't female Space Marines has nothing to do with lore or background or character of Marines. It's to do with the simple logistics of making miniatures and selling miniatures." In the 1980s, Games Workshop sold miniatures in sets called blister packs. The intention was that upwards of 25% of all models would be female. That didn't last because retailers kept complaining to us that customers weren't buying the female models and could we not include any in their restocks. All the background fluff about why there are only male Marines is there to justify a commercial logistics issue, end quote. From the mouth of the guy who was the head of IP at Games Workshop themselves, he explains it in simple terms as to why Space Marines or Custodians were never female. It was because, obviously, there was never a demand for it from the fan base. And this was well before the term woke or anything really even existed within the cultural zeitgeist. These were the fans that bought these miniatures and supported Games Workshop well before things like being a geek was cool or anything like it is now. So even back then, without the predisposed notion of wokeness or forced diversity even being a thing, the fan base rejected these concepts, and for good reason. You can't really say these fans from decades ago were somehow alt-right or anything either. They were simply fans of something when things were arguably much simpler than they are now. Which is why it's so puzzling these days for companies wanting to push concepts into these markets and franchises when they are clearly not being accepted now or even back then. Nobody wants female Space Marines or Custodians. The only people that want it are people who won't buy your product anyway. The truth is that the majority of the time when these groups who advocate for diversity and inclusion cry from the rooftops that they want more forced diversity, they rarely ever support the things they demand when it comes to actually opening their wallets. Maybe it's because they're all self-proclaimed communists and therefore have the brain-rotted opinion that they shouldn't have to work in order to live, and believe the government should fulfill their every need, and we know there's a ton of them who unironically do think that way. But the truth is that if these things like forced diversity or pushing for female variants and things that are objectively male dominated is wanted, then they would sell well. But as we know, many products, like even games, don't sell well or even do well critically when they champion these ideas. Forspoken, Suicide Squad, Validate, and more are just games that push the idea of female representation and diversity. Yet when those games released, they didn't review well at all, and not enough people bought them either. Even the reviewers scored them low, the very same people who also usually push for these sorts of ideas. So like I said, if these are concepts these demographics want, which are likely the same who would say, sure, let's have female space marines and custodians, the reality is they only support the idea of it happening. But if they're told they need to spend $50 to, I don't know, $100 per product in order to support the very concepts they champion, they either can't afford it because they have no money because they're communists, or they're unwilling to, and they just expect the actual fans and customers of varying franchises to do the heavy lifting for them instead. But the people who do have money and support these things don't want these ideas, and they reject it, and then what these companies are left with is a product that's for nobody. That not only loses money, and then the same communist blue-haired weirdos who cry feminism throw their arms up in the air without yet again ever lifting a finger to do anything to change it. The idea of female custodians, marines, or any other forced retcon change can always be reduced to the simple concept of, does the actual market want this? And if these people maybe stopped buying overpriced lattes with stickers like Smash Capitalism slapped on their Apple MacBook Pros, they could maybe afford to support the change they want to see. But this is the problem we're at, and of course these websites are all attempting to state that it isn't their ideas or lack of support that is the problem. But it is instead you that is the problem for not willing to support their moronic crusades with your money so they don't have to. As Belle of Lost Souls puts it, they think the only people who are against this notion are the fans themselves. Which is a bold move to make considering your website is quite literally a fan website itself, and attacking the very fans that likely support your independent slice of the internet is always a terrible idea. But here's a little of what this moronic article had to say, and I quote. As seems to happen every time Games Workshop takes a step to be more inclusive to get more people into the hobby, some bigots on the internet are mad. In a number of online spaces, including comments on our website, people have come out to protest this update. In general, they position themselves as guardians of the lore. Maybe even a few people reading this are in this position. You might be able to tell me how you're not a bigot at all. You simply really care about 40K lore and its sanctity. But you know what? Save yourself the breath and take a seat. The truth is that 40K has never cared one bit about the internal consistency of its own lore. There have been countless retcons and changes galore from the very first days of 40K. Indeed, 40K is specifically written so that there is no truth, imperfect narrators are the norm, and that everything can and often does change at any moment. And yet people still get mad about only a small subsection of these things. The arguments about caring about the lore fall apart pretty quickly when you look at what people seem to be mad about, because it always seems to be when women get introduced that you see anger popping up on the internet. Female custodians, people care about the lore all of a sudden. The Primarchs have a mother, protect the lore. Aymar Astardi was a woman, my lore. Games Workshop makes a major retcon to the entire setting, changing the timeline and lengthening the Indominus Crusade, not a peep. For that last one, Games Workshop even went back and rewrote parts of novels to correct the lore. They've never done anything like that before. An actual eraser of past lore, and yet strangely no one really cared, threatened to burn their armies in protest or quit the hobby. Until the 9th edition Imperial Guard Codex, we've never heard of the Rogel Dorn tank, and then suddenly it was there and always was there. Just like with countless other units and tanks before, no one cared about that. But do the exact same thing with a woman. We've never heard of female custodians before, and now they exist and always have, and a set of people gets really riled up. The same thing happened mere months ago with the similar introduction of female Bretonnian knights. When the same people only seem to get upset about the lore when the role of women and other minorities is getting expanded and never at any other points, it's crystal clear what these people's agenda really is and who they really are. Bigots to be ignored." End quote. The writer here does say that Warhammer has retconned things in the past, and they're right, they have. However, it depends on what exactly has been retconned that determines the response per se. For example, they state in that section that Games Workshop added a new tank to the 9th edition codex called the Rogel Dorn tank. But that's not exactly something that undermines or changes the entire lore. It's a tank, it's a vehicle. It would be like retconning the lore to say, oh, actually Space Marines always had a rocket launcher that shoots launched corpses of their enemies. That would actually be pretty metal now that I'm saying that, but the introduction of vehicles or tools within the arsenal of an army doesn't destroy the lore. That would ruin the lore if, say, the IP was Lord of the Rings or something. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Amazon Studios in Rings of Power Season 2 just introduced a random helicopter with a minigun attached to it. Yeah, that would probably break the lore a little because the setting is medieval fantasy, so why the hell is there a helicopter shooting bullets into orcs' heads? That kind of thing would break the lore because it goes beyond the concepts of tools and vehicles and instead introduces entirely new eras of technology to a world that hasn't attained that level of ingenuity. But in Warhammer's case, introducing a new version of a tank to a pre-existing faction is totally fine, or a gun or something too. Because the setting and lore of Warhammer confirms that they obviously have the means and technical know-how in that particular franchise to create things like tanks. I mean, they have space travel in Warhammer, so a tank being added, it's fine. The way I look at this whole female custodian thing is that you can't just randomly add things if they go against the tenets of the lore of a franchise. For example, let's look at The Witcher. In that franchise's lore, it is distinctively stated that only men can become Witchers. It comes down to their chromosomes and biology and the fact that the trial of grasses, which is in this case you don't know, it's a procedure combining medical and alchemical means in order to turn a human male into a supernatural killing machine. They replace a young boy's eyes with that of a cat. They inject alchemical potion mixtures into the veins of the young boys within these trials in order to make their bodies far more powerful than that of an ordinary man. The trial of the grasses is not even guaranteed, mind you, and many of the young initiate boys end up dying before the procedure is even completed, which is why in the Witcher's world there isn't a billion Witchers just running across the continent. But it's because of that procedure that the young boys that do survive the trial of grasses they are bestowed with the unnatural speed, senses, and strength of various creatures. Because in a way, a Witcher is a sort of Frankensteinian being that shouldn't exist. It's also why all Witchers are sterile and cannot have children because the poisons render their bodies unable to procreate. And it's also because of the procedures that Witchers are able to drink various potions that include letting them to see in the dark or turn their blood into boiling poison. So if a vampire bites them, for example, the vampire will burn from the inside out from consuming a Witcher's blood. All of these things are to ensure that humanity has a weapon that can appropriately face against the inhuman forces the continent is drowning in. And again, because of these procedures, not only do most young boys not make it, but young girls in general will absolutely die from the procedures as well. In my opinion, the fact men can only become Witchers is a very important part of the lore within that world, and I would like to think that if suddenly there was always female Witchers, it would understandably piss off a lot of fans, and for good reason. So I can sympathize with the Warhammer fans out there when it comes to their want for there to be a mutual respect for the lore and principles of the franchise they love. Because without respect for not only the lore, but the audience at large, these franchises understandably have nothing at all. And I think when I see these fan websites or PC Gamer and others attempt to gaslight and attack fans for not wanting to accept these changes, it proves more so that these sites are about as fluid as their own morals, which is to say they don't have any and they can change them on a dime. Morals matter. It's what defines us. Spider-Man, for example, refuses to kill people. Changing that moral for him would change his character completely. The same way if Punisher suddenly decided he wanted to stop killing people and wanted to stop his crusade and become a yoga instructor, that would go against who he is as a character too. These things, they need to matter, otherwise nothing matters, and that's what these companies and their talking head pieces like this Belle of Lost Souls who hates their own audience are trying to change. Then the same Belle of Lost Souls writer attempts to use a previous article he's written as proof that Warhammer has always been woke. Back in 2023, the same writer made this article titled, Warhammer 40K, the Emperor is Genderqueer and 4 Other Major Reveals from the End and the Death Volume 1. Here's what that writer said in order to defend the idea that Warhammer has always been woke, and I quote, The book reveals that the being known as the Emperor has been many different people during their life. This isn't really new knowledge. However, while we know the being that sits the Golden Throne as he, it turns out that hasn't always been the case. In the past, the Emperor has lived both as a man and a woman, living whole lives as women and changing at will and need. It seems clear the Emperor is genderqueer and can live and present as they wish. How the Emperor feels isn't known, but how they present is. In fact, we don't even know for sure what gender was assigned to the Emperor at birth. In Master of Mankind, there is a section on the boy who would be king, which seems to show the Emperor as male at a young age. However, these visions are very likely lies. In addition, they don't confirm anything about the Emperor's birth. The Emperor in many ways is above gender, and this makes sense for their character. I hope we see more like this. Interestingly, it opens up the possibility that the Emperor could become a woman again in the future, end quote. There's so much wrong here, but no, the Emperor of Mankind is not a woman, nor are they genderqueer, despite what this writer is saying. The fact they even try to gaslight you by saying we don't know what gender the Emperor was assigned at birth is just wrong. Look, I'm not all-knowing when it comes to Warhammer, I admit that, but I think I know enough to tell you, dear viewer, that what this writer is saying is absolute nonsense. What we do know 100% is that the Emperor of Mankind is essentially a being that was created through the collective actions of human shamans. To keep it simple, way back in time, like we're talking even before our time right now, which in Warhammer terms we're living in the past of that franchise's current events, but anyways. There were human beings during the Neolithic period of mankind's existence known as shamans. These shamans are considered to be the first human psychers. In case you don't know what a psyker is, they're basically beings who possess massive psychic powers. In a simpler term for you to understand it, imagine the psyker gene to be similar to that of Marvel's X-Men. Some people have the X gene, some don't. Same thing with psychers. Anyway, what these psyker shamans would do is when they were going to die, they would reincarnate into a new body, but on an individual basis, of course. But eventually, through the collective consciousness of humanity and the ever-growing threat of the warp, which is basically this other dimension outside of physical reality, where chaos and demons reside, humanity was threatened by the existence of this warp. So because of this, it became increasingly more difficult for these shamans to reincarnate because of the presence of the warp. And some shamans couldn't reincarnate due to the human collective consciousness becoming perverted by the warp and the forces of chaos. So what the shamans all decided, who all came from different walks of life and places in the world, they gathered all together and agreed that the only way to fight back against the warp and the forces of chaos was to unite their powers to protect humanity. So all of these shamans basically gave their powers willingly into a shared pool of psychic power, I guess you could say. So these shamans took poison one by one in order to end their own lives. And they all combined their psychic powers and they all collectively reincarnated as one single being known as the New Man. Not woman, man. This one supreme being of incredible psychic potential would be born from an ordinary mother and father. The being was born a young boy in a Neolithic settlement of Anatolian farmers, which in terms of today's world, that would place this being's birthplace to be somewhere around modern Turkey or so. This boy would become the Emperor eventually, and because this new man had all the combined psychic powers of all the previous shamans before, the new man had all of their experience, memories, and talents, and due to the incredible psychic powers they held, the new man was immortal and could not die, by normal means anyway, so death and sickness were gone from the equation. And the Emperor of Mankind would basically watch over humanity for thousands of years and could use his incredible psyker abilities to transform his image into other beings. This is where the writer attempts to state that because of this the Emperor is genderqueer, but that's not true. It could simply be that the Emperor would use his psychic potential to change his appearance in order to disguise himself in order to, let's say, I don't know, get into a building or something. Or how I interpret it anyway is that the Emperor was pretty much like Professor Xavier from the X-Men. I don't know why I'm using so many X-Men references here, but whatever, it works alright. And the way I see it, the Emperor didn't change his gender or something. Instead, because he was a psychic, he would just trick the minds of the people around him to see him how he wanted to be seen. Because it's stated in his lore that the Emperor would influence events in mankind's upbringing by taking the form of different people. But again, he could simply be using his psychic powers to trick everyone's minds. After all, if the Emperor wanted you to see him look like the Big Bird from Sesame Street, I don't think he would literally turn into Big Bird, although maybe he could, but the more likely scenario is he just told your brain to see Big Bird instead. Anyway, the reason why I just decided to explain the lore of who the Emperor of Mankind is was to prove to you that this writer is a dummy and is attempting to retcon and gaslight you into believing things in order to fit agendas. The Emperor of Mankind is not genderqueer or whatever other nonsense they want to spew. The shamans are even referred to as wise men, which pretty much confirms that the psychers that became the new man were only men themselves. And even if it turns out that there were female psychers among them, the end result doesn't matter anyways. Because in the end, the being that was born in the Neolithic era of Warhammer 40K's timeline was without a doubt a human boy, and was not a girl or genderqueer to any capacity. Now, the Emperor is pretty much a being slowly rotting on a gold throne that keeps him alive, which requires thousands of psychers to be sacrificed on a daily basis in order to feed psychic energy, so that he can keep the forces of chaos away from the Imperium of Man and protect their minds from the warp. But the point here is that what this writer is attempting to do, alongside Games Workshop telling you that, oh, the lore isn't important anyway, is that they're trying to change things and have you accept it. But thankfully fans are saying no, but that isn't stopping them from trying anyway. Even Gizmodo is throwing their gooch into the ring with their article titled, Warhammer 40K's new culture war crossfire is a mess of its own making. A single story about female custodians has made Games Workshop's sci-fi future the target of grifters and elements of a toxic fan base it has failed to stamp out. It's that sub-headline that really matters here. They want to get rid of their loyal fan base that doesn't agree with these changes and replace them. But it's clearly not working at all and they hate that, but what can you expect when the websites come to defend their every action and even fan sites are attempting to gaslight you into believing that the Emperor of Mankind is genderqueer now too? It's all deliberately being pushed to change how you interact with and perceive this property, and the same can be said for others too. And speaking of gaslighting and changing narratives, let's quickly switch over to Kotaku, who is now being more moronic than usual. From Kotaku, there is this article titled, Hades 2 is the kind of hot we need right now. And by the way, I will not be using Hades trailer footage in this part of the video, because last time I did that, I got a copyright claim. Which is stupid by the way, so I'll just play random game footage in this segment instead. Don't blame me, alright? Some companies are dumb like that. Anyway, this article comes from Alyssa Mercanti of all people, who again proves that she's ideologically inept in every regard. This is also the same person who hates Eve in Stellar Blade and thinks she's gross, yet she loves and champions Hades' designs. The same person who said this on Twitter. They want their women to be virtually silent, overly sexualized dolls in video games that they can jerk off to without having to wash their ass or clip their nails, or show even a single attractive quality, is apparently saying these characters are the right kind of sexy. Ah yes, an overweight man who is bounded to a wheelchair who likely can't shower himself is the epitome of sexy in their eyes. Except she literally just said that she hates men who can't wash their butts or clip their nails. But the only reason she includes Hephaestus here from Hades is simply because he ticks the disabled box on her chart. Then of course there's Aphrodite, who is literally just naked with her hair covering their genitals. And I have to censor her on screen here because, fun fact, even Supergiant Games, which makes Hades 2, got their own stream banned on Twitch for apparent nudity for showing the character's full body on screen. Yet we both know if this design was Eve from Stellar Blade with pink hair and everything with the exact same outfit, they would hate it with a passion. But I think the reason why Aphrodite gets a pass here where Eve doesn't is pretty simple really. It's because Hades 2 is a Western-made game, so it magically is better than Stellar Blade or any other Asian-made media because it's the West. Not to mention Aphrodite has been getting criticism for looking T-coded, which means trans, and honestly when I look at the character, yeah, I can see it. That's another reason likely why these journals like Alyssa Mercanti defended while trashing Stellar Blade so much. In case you haven't noticed, everything in this video can conveniently be summed up as right versus wrong think pretty much. And it's obvious that the Western gaming sphere has a right-think way when it comes to sexuality and degeneracy that must be abided by. I mean, how can you say that Eve is overly sexualized when her default outfit has her completely covered? And yet Aphrodite has no clothing on whatsoever and has just her hair covering her essentials. Which again, I can't even show the full image on YouTube for censorship reasons. It's moronic is what it is, and just like them trying to say the Emperor of Mankind is genderqueer, these are all retcons across the board. They're attempting to quietly go back and change things in order to say, well, that's how it's always been, so you can be accepting of these changes, but no, that's not how that works. And I guarantee you when Hades 2 releases, they'll shower the game with praise. And look, I love Supergiant's games because they're fun to play and they're well crafted. And I think it's unfair and eye-roll worthy that Kotaku and others are trying to use it as some sort of gotcha by pulling them into the conversation, but like I said, these same people would look right past a real person who looked like this Hephaestus. They just like the idea of it to push a narrative. Just like I said previously too, they like the idea of these changes like female custodians and so on, but they don't necessarily support these ideas with money. They just want you to buy them so that they can use it as gotchas in their articles, and that's really it. But as you can see, the gaslighting of the everyday player is nowhere nearing an end, and that's okay. That's why I'm here, fellas. To call these people out and show to you that they don't see you as anything more than a consumer meant to consume in the end. But like always, you have the power, and without your engagement, money, and support, their ideas and platforms will fail. So vote with your wallet, laugh to yourself as they fall apart, and remember that you're not crazy, you're just living in a crazy world. As always, thank you for watching, and thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel too. Like, subscribe, and share the video, and have a wonderful day. They can gaslight and attack you all they want, you have the power, and never forget that. And I'll see you in the next one.